All right, today I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the issue of self-disclosure. And it's a really important issue for us to explore, especially if you are doing an internship or you're early on in your career. It's one you may not be comfortable with, and you may be trying to find what the right balance is for you. So we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of using self-disclosure and what that looks like in different settings. So all this information is coming from an article called Self-Disclosure and Transparency in Psychotherapy and Counseling. So if you get a chance, check that original article out. It's pretty well written and very clear and concise as far as the information it's covering. In that article, the author discusses four types of self-disclosure that you can see there. There's deliberate, unavoidable, accidental, and client-initiated. So we'll go into each of those in more detail. Here you can see types 1 and type 2. So first of all, type 1 is deliberate. This is where the counselor voluntarily discloses information to the client. It could be the counselor sharing that they've gone through the same kind of situation as the client, maybe talking a little bit about their own personal life. For example, that they have a family or that they have kids. That would be an example of self-revealing self-disclosure, where you're voluntarily giving up that information. There's also a type called self-involving, which would be an immediate kind of in-session reaction, almost like countertransference, where the client says or does something and you have kind of a natural human reaction to it. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Here we're just making you aware that that is a form of self-disclosure where the client is going to know maybe how you genuinely feel or think about a particular issue. That's why we do try to be really aware of our posture, our facial expressions, and the things we're saying to clients. Not that we can't be genuine, but we have to think about how the client is going to interpret what we're doing and saying when we're talking to them. Type 2 is called unavoidable self-disclosure. This is information that other people pick up about you just by seeing you, interacting with you. It can be anything from your age, your gender, your race, physical ability, your socioeconomic status, whether you're married or not. For example, if you do wear a wedding band, people are going to assume that you're married probably. Even some of your nonverbal reactions may give cues to the client about how you're feeling or what you're thinking when you may not intend it to. Now, sometimes these can be assumptions by the client. So, the way somebody else assumes you are racially or how you identify in terms of your gender or how old you are, that may not be actually how you identify, but clients may be assuming that about you and making judgments about you based on that information. Same thing with socioeconomic status, marital status. So we just want to be aware that that can happen. Sometimes we can't avoid these things, but that's why we have open communication and try to discuss these things with our clients so they don't interfere with the helping process. Taking a look at the next two types, number 3 is called accidental self-disclosure. So these are unplanned and unintended. These are these kind of reactions that we might have in a session where we may just blurt something out, maybe saying, "Oh, I went through the exact same thing," or I had a relative who died last year also, after a client has shared that they've had a loss. Maybe you didn't intend to share that information or even want the client to know, but sometimes things just slip out. Also, an example would be seeing a client outside of the treatment setting where you weren't intentionally meeting them. Maybe you just saw them at the same grocery store, or at the same restaurant, or whatever it is. And if that happens, it's not the end of the world, but then the client may have an idea, oh, I know where this person lives, I know where this person shops. They may be seeing you with your kids or with a partner or significant other. So again, they're picking up all this kind of information about you. Now keep in mind, you should never initiate an interaction with a client if you see them out in the world, whether it's at a place where they work or a place where you just run into them. I've had experiences where I've seen clients places. I won't completely ignore them or act like they're not there, but I won't go out of my way to say anything to them. However, if a client does say hi to you and acknowledge you, it's perfectly appropriate to say hi back to them. So you don't want to be rude to them, but you also don't want to initiate contact, which could violate their confidentiality. Finally, type number 4 is what's called client-initiated self-disclosure. So really this isn't you disclosing anything, it's the client almost kind of digging and trying to find out more about you. So maybe they're asking you direct questions, maybe they're going to your colleagues, other people you work with, even other clients, trying to find out, what is this person like? Where do they live? How much money do you think they make? Are they married? Do they have kids? Are they in recovery? That's one, if you work in substance abuse treatment, a question that often comes up is, are you in recovery or not? It could even be the case that a client tries to dig information up online or tries to find your Facebook page or anything that's posted about you online. So be very aware of what is out there for people to see and to find if they were to go looking. Here's a history of how self-disclosure has evolved over time, starting in the early 1900s with Sigmund Freud, who of course starts the psychoanalytic approach to therapy. And at that point, Freud and other psychoanalysts were very much opposed to having close relationships with the client. The therapist was seen as just kind of a blank slate who could be a mirror and reflect back to the client what was going on with them, but should really not have any kind of interaction, should be very neutral and almost unknown to the client. The less that was known, the better. That really changed in the middle of the 20th century. Think about Carl Rogers and his person-centered approach and other counselors who use that same kind of model. The humanist movement, which really takes off in the 1960s, says that self-disclosure has a lot of therapeutic value. It allows the professional to be authentic and more genuine. Carl Rogers used this a lot, self-disclosure, very much in the moment, in the here and now with his clients, which I think has a lot of benefit to it. A possible drawback is that you could almost lose yourself in your role as a professional a little bit. And if you watch some of the work Carl Rogers did, he often, I think, would lose himself and very much come across as just having a conversation with the client. And he would reveal all kinds of personal feelings he was having in the moment. Some clients might not be comfortable with that, and it worked for him, but it's something you want to be aware of how much you're revealing to the client and what the impact is going to be on them. The feminist movement has a very similar kind of approach, looking at disclosure as being a beneficial tool and really looking at it as a way to promote equality or egalitarianism between the client and the counselor, as a way to bring up marginalized populations and allow them to be at the same level as the professional rather than creating this huge divide. Think about then TV shows of the 1980s and 90s, especially talk shows, even like Oprah Winfrey, if you remember the show Donahue. Ellen uses it, and it's still going on now, where there's a kind of self-help approach, and we'd often see celebrities, TV stars go on these shows, or even sometimes the talk show hosts themselves, and reveal all kinds of personal information, talking about their struggles with mental health issues, substance abuse, their personal life, maybe going through divorce. And it would have this almost confessional kind of quality, providing a feeling of catharsis or relief for both the person who's on the show as well as for the audience. This also gives rise to a lot of the reality TV shows that we see today, where as the viewer, we almost become voyeurs watching celebrities and other people at home and seeing them reveal all kinds of parts about themselves, and we almost want to know everything about somebody's private life. And in an era of social media and the internet, we have much less privacy, and so it's interesting that that also carries over in some ways into the counseling and therapeutic setting, where a lot of our clients may expect to know more about us personally. So as that's evolved, I think we have to continue considering what role self-disclosure plays, because it's going to be some part of our interaction, and you have to decide what level is comfortable for you. You also have to decide what level is appropriate for the setting you're working in and for the clients you're working with. So right now the field is at a point where we accept that there is more self-disclosure generally as part of the helping process. A lot of it is up to the individual to make good judgments. You will find agencies that have blanket policies to maybe limit self-disclosure if it's become a problem that's actually harming the clients. So it's something you want to be aware of, what your comfort level is with self-disclosure as a professional. Thinking about different specific populations you might work with, there are some populations where self-disclosure plays a kind of unique role. So with adolescents, they often respond very well to self-disclosure and to counselors kind of humanizing themselves and letting the adolescent know that they maybe understand where they're coming from or have been through similar situations, even if they don't understand everything that's going on, that you can be more relatable if you're on a certain level. Adolescents often find that if they don't know anything about their counselor, they're more resistant and hesitant to engage with them. If you work in faith-based counseling or spiritual-based therapy, typically the counselor would be expected to share and talk about their personal values and beliefs so that the client knows that that's going in, that that's a big part of the counseling process, and you're going to be using maybe a particular spiritual or religious approach to doing the work with them. Gay and lesbian clients report in surveys that they have higher level of trust if they work with a counselor who also identifies with the same sexuality. Very similar for military veterans who prefer that they would work with somebody who's been a veteran and understands the military culture. And ethnic minorities also say they're more comfortable working with a counselor who identifies with the same ethnic group, or interestingly, that the client at least perceives that the counselor belongs to the same group or to the same minority, even if it may not be the case. So some areas of caution here. This is the last slide we're going to look at. Some things you want to be careful about, because even though self-disclosure has a lot of benefits, it's something you will use to some extent. You want to be careful not to rely on it as your only tool. And remember that as soon as you say something and share it, it's probably going to be shared with other clients as well. So especially early in your career, you just want to go cautiously and slowly as far as using self-disclosure. So some guidelines here: you should never use self-disclosure if it's only for your own benefit. If it's just to make yourself feel better or to try to win points with the client or something like that, that's not a good tool then. Remember that information you share, even though it may only be with one client or a small group of clients, it may go to other clients and be shared even if you don't want it to be. So be careful about that. When you're using self-disclosure, especially in a group, the focus can very quickly shift away from the client or the group of clients onto you as the professional. And suddenly you're the one that everyone's talking about and everyone's focusing on. And if you notice that happening, then you know you've gone off track and you need to get things back on track. As I mentioned, some agencies will have their own policy about how you use self-disclosure and whether certain things can or cannot be shared. And so you want to familiarize yourself with that before using any type of self-disclosure. A lot of times when you're early in your career, you're an intern or you're brand new at a job, you want to have an absolute rule about, yes, always do this, never do this. And usually it's not quite as black and white as that. It's not quite as simple as that. You're trying to do what's in the client's best interest. You're also trying to be authentic to yourself as a counselor. My general guide would be, don't use it a lot at first, because then that tends to be the tool you're going to rely on too often. So I would go slowly with it at first, but there isn't going to be an absolute rule. I think as you become more confident in your abilities as a counselor, as you work with more groups, work with more clients, you'll find a good balance of what works for you and your population and the setting you're in. So I think it's going to change depending on what type of clients you're working with and what kind of setting you're working in. And then finally, keep in mind, ask yourself the question, how will the client view me after I make this disclosure? So is this going to be something that the client's constantly thinking about? So if I share that I'm in recovery, or if I share that I go to meetings, will the client always be just thinking about, I wonder if this person went to a meeting this week, or I wonder how their recovery is going? Is it going to be something that helps and benefits the client, or is it just going to take the attention off of them and almost be a distraction to the helping process? All right, I hope that this information was useful to you. Self-disclosure is very much an open-ended issue that, as we saw, is evolving over time and is something that you need to think about on an individual level for yourself as a professional as you go into the field. So hopefully this gave you a few things to think about and use as you go forward in your practice.